Year 1818, Baikonur area. Notes of excavated platforms under material inconsistent with history. The land around Baikonur stretches outward without interruption, a broad, open surface where the eye finds nothing to settle on for long. The steppe lies flat beneath a high sky, its colors shifting with light and season but rarely with form. Wind moves through dry grass and low shrubs, tracing patterns that disappear as quickly as they form. There are no walls breaking the horizon, no streets converging toward a center, no ruins rising above the ground to suggest a forgotten city. The landscape communicates emptiness with confidence, as if it has always been this way and expects to remain so. For generations, this space has been understood through the logic of movement rather than permanence. The histories associated with this region speak of pastoral routes, seasonal migrations, and temporary encampments that leave little behind once they move on. The dominant image is that of mobility, people following grass and water, structures light enough to be assembled and dismantled without trace. Stone, in this context, appears only as scattered outcrops or natural features, not as something shaped, placed, or organized into lasting forms. The steppe is remembered as a place of passage, not of construction. This understanding feels intuitive when standing there. The ground offers no obvious foundation. The soil is shallow in places, layered with sediment and grass roots rather than compacted earth. Heavy structures would sink, crack, or demand constant repair. Everything about the environment encourages lightness and flexibility. It discourages weight. It resists permanence. The absence of visible architecture reinforces the assumption that none ever existed. What remains above ground appears to confirm what history has long repeated, and then, quietly, a different note enters the record. In 1818, accounts from the region describe the presence of stone foundations beneath the surface of the steppe, not scattered stones or natural formations, but large blocks arranged with intention, forming bases that follow clear geometric patterns. These were not exposed ruins standing in the open. They were buried, covered by layers of soil and vegetation that suggested time rather than sudden destruction. Their discovery did not come from the uncovering of walls or towers, but from encounters with stone where none was expected, encountered below ground during surveying or excavation. The foundations were substantial. Their scale exceeded what would be required for temporary use. The stones were placed deliberately, aligned with one another, forming shapes that implied structures once stood above them. This was not material carried for convenience and abandoned. It was material selected, transported, and set into the earth with purpose. The presence of such foundations does not align easily with the established picture of a landscape shaped exclusively by nomadic life. The contrast is not dramatic at first glance. The steppe remains open and quiet. Nothing rises to challenge the horizon. Yet beneath that surface lies evidence that introduces friction into the familiar narrative. Stone foundations imply planning. They imply investment of energy and time. They imply a reason to build something meant to last, at least long enough to justify the effort. They imply a relationship to the land that extends beyond seasonal use. No explanation accompanies these stones in the record. The accounts note their existence without expanding on origin or function. They do not describe a settlement that vanished, nor do they connect the foundations to a known cultural shift. The stones appear, are acknowledged, and then recede into silence, covered again by the assumptions that surround the region. Standing on the steppe today, nothing forces the issue. The wind continues to move across grass. The land appears unchanged. The stones remain out of sight. Yet the knowledge that they are there alters how the surface is perceived. What once seemed empty now feels layered. What once appeared uniform now suggests depth. And the first question arises naturally, without urgency or accusation, shaped by the simple fact of stone beneath soil. Who placed these foundations here, and for what purpose, in a landscape that history tells us was never meant to hold them? The conventional historical understanding of the Baikonur region is rooted in the broader study of Central Asian nomadic life, a framework that has remained largely consistent across academic disciplines. For centuries, the steppe has been interpreted as an environment that shaped its inhabitants through movement rather than settlement. Climate, vegetation, and geography combined to favor mobility, and societies adapted accordingly. Seasonal migration allowed herders to follow grazing cycles, avoiding overuse of land and responding flexibly to drought, cold, or scarcity. Permanence, in this context, was not an advantage but a liability. Social organization reflected this reality. Communities were structured around kinship and seasonal coordination rather than fixed urban centers. Authority moved with people, not with buildings. Leadership was exercised through networks rather than institutions anchored to place. Housing followed the same logic. Portable dwellings made from wood frames, felt, and fabric could be assembled quickly and dismantled just as easily. These structures provided insulation against harsh winters and ventilation during hot summers, all while remaining light enough to transport. The absence of stone architecture was not seen as a lack of capability, but as a rational response to environmental conditions. Materials available on the steppe reinforced this pattern. Timber, suitable for large-scale construction, was scarce in open grassland regions. Stone existed, but often at considerable distance from areas of regular habitation. Transporting heavy materials across vast, infrastructure-poor landscapes required energy that offered little return when the resulting structures could not be easily maintained or defended. In contrast, light materials could be sourced locally or traded in manageable quantities. The material culture that developed was efficient, adaptable, and resilient within its ecological niche. Climate further shaped these choices. The steppe experiences extreme seasonal variation, with cold winters, hot summers, and strong winds. Structures fixed to the ground would have faced constant exposure to these elements without the benefit of dense surrounding settlement to support, repair, and upkeep. Mobility allowed communities to avoid the worst conditions rather than endure them in place. Over time, this adaptability became a defining feature of steppe societies and a central theme in how historians described the region. Within this established framework, Baikonur appears in historical maps and texts as a geographic reference rather than a cultural anomaly. It is marked as part of a corridor traversed by peoples and trade routes, not as a destination defined by monumental construction. No chronicles describe cities rising from its soil. No architectural traditions are associated with it. The absence of ruins above ground reinforces the interpretation. The land seems to confirm the story told about it. This is the version of history that feels stable. It aligns environment with culture, material with behavior, and geography with social form. It explains why stone buildings are not expected, why foundations are not sought, and why the steppe is imagined as empty, even when it has long been inhabited. Within this logic, the past is coherent, and deviations appear unlikely. The first deviation enters quietly, not as a challenge to the entire framework, but as a specific observation recorded at a particular moment. In 1818, reports from the Baikonur area noted the presence of stone foundations beneath the surface of the steppe. These were not casual mentions of scattered rocks or natural formations exposed by erosion. The accounts describe large stone blocks arranged in deliberate patterns, forming bases that suggested structural intent. The stones were set in alignment, their placement following straight lines and right angles rather than the irregular distribution expected of natural deposits. The scale of these foundations stood out. They were larger than what would be required to support temporary structures. Their dimensions implied weight-bearing capacity, as though they once carried loads significant enough to justify such construction. The stones themselves were not loose or randomly piled. They were set into the ground, forming continuous surfaces rather than isolated elements. This arrangement indicated planning and execution rather than opportunistic use of available material. Equally notable was the depth at which these foundations were found. They lay beneath layers of soil that had accumulated over time, suggesting gradual burial rather than sudden collapse. Vegetation had reclaimed the surface, and the land above showed no obvious sign of disturbance. The foundations were not ruins in the conventional sense. They did not rise above ground to announce their presence. They existed quietly, only becoming known when the soil was cut away. Nothing in the established narrative accounted for such structures. Nomadic dwellings do not require stone foundations of this size. Seasonal camps leave light traces that fade quickly once abandoned. Even semi-permanent installations associated with trade or military activity typically rely on earthworks or timber rather than heavy stone in regions where transport is difficult. The foundations described in 1818 did not fit these categories easily. The reports did not provide context. They did not identify the builders, date the construction, or describe any superstructure that once stood above the stone. There was no accompanying record of settlement, no mention of a population that might have required such bases. The foundations were noted, measured in general terms, and then left without further elaboration. They entered the historical record as facts, without narrative. This is where the familiar story begins to strain. The presence of stone foundations does not immediately overturn the understanding of steppe life. It does, however, introduce an element that resists easy classification. Foundations imply intention. They imply an expectation of duration. They imply a decision to invest labor and resources into a fixed point on the landscape. These implications sit uneasily alongside a model built on movement and impermanence. The questions that follow are simple in form but difficult in scope. What kind of structure required such foundations? Who built it in a region not known for stone construction? And why does the land above show no sign of what once stood there? The historical record does not answer these questions. It does not deny them either. It simply does not engage with them beyond the initial acknowledgement. The steppe, from above, remains unchanged. The wind still moves across grass. The horizon remains open. Yet beneath that surface, the foundations persist, holding their shape long after the context that produced them has faded from view. They do not announce a forgotten city, nor do they demand a rewritten history. They exist as material facts that sit just outside the boundaries of the accepted narrative, quietly marking a place where the story of the land becomes less certain and more layered than it first appears. The stones recorded beneath the Baikonur steppe do not announce themselves as extraordinary by their appearance alone. They are described simply as large blocks, worked enough to form stable bases, set into the ground with deliberate alignment. Yet when considered within the material culture of the region, their presence becomes difficult to contextualize. Central Asian nomadic societies historically favored materials that matched mobility. Wood that could be disassembled, felt that could be folded and transported, leather that could endure weather without weight. These materials balance durability with lightness. Stone, by contrast, resists movement. It demands effort not only to shape, but to relocate. Its use implies a willingness to invest energy into a fixed point, accepting immobility as part of the design. The type of stone noted in the 1818 records is not described in decorative terms, but in functional ones. The blocks were large enough to carry load, heavy enough to remain stable, and arranged in patterns that suggested structural planning rather than opportunistic placement. Even without precise measurements, the language implies mass and intention. Stone of this nature does not serve temporary purposes. It does not reward short-term use. Its value lies in endurance, in the expectation that what is placed upon it will remain long enough to justify the cost of extraction and transport. That cost matters. Quarrying stone requires tools capable of cutting and splitting dense material. It requires time, labor, and coordination. Transporting stone multiplies that investment. Each kilometer adds friction, risk, and delay. In regions where stone architecture flourished, such as parts of the Mediterranean or the Middle East, quarries were often located near settlements, rivers, or coastlines that eased movement. Architectural traditions evolved alongside infrastructure that supported heavy materials. In the Baikonur region, such support systems are not readily apparent in the historical record. When compared to traditional nomadic materials, the contrast sharpens. A yurt can be erected or dismantled in hours, its components redistributed across pack animals. Its footprint leaves little trace once removed. Stone foundations do the opposite. They fix a location. They alter the ground permanently. They require planning not just for construction, but for what follows. The choice to use stone is therefore a choice about relationship to place. It suggests continuity rather than circulation. Comparison with stone architecture elsewhere reinforces this point. In regions known for ancient stone construction, foundations are often accompanied by walls, roads, or debris fields that persist above ground. Even when buildings collapse, stone remains visible, marking former settlements clearly. At Baikonur, the situation is reversed. The foundations exist, but the superstructures do not. The stone is present, but hidden. This inversion complicates interpretation. It implies either that the structures above were made of lighter materials that vanished, or that something altered the surface after construction. Energy expenditure offers another lens. To justify the effort of stone construction, a society must expect return, whether through defense, administration, storage, or ritual significance. Stone is not chosen casually. Its extraction and placement represent concentrated labor, often organized beyond the household level. Such organization does not contradict nomadic life in principle, but it does suggest a moment or context in which permanence was valued enough to outweigh mobility. The foundations hint at such a moment without defining it. The physical environment of Baikonur adds another layer to the problem. The steppe is not a uniform slab of rock. It consists of layered soils, sediments deposited over long periods by wind and water. In many areas, the ground lacks the compressive strength needed to support heavy loads without preparation. Stone foundations in such conditions require careful placement, often involving leveling, compaction, or additional support. These are not insurmountable challenges, but they are deliberate ones. They imply knowledge of ground behavior and an intention to counteract it. Distance to suitable stone sources compounds the issue. If local stone was unavailable or unsuitable, material would have to be brought from afar. Without established roads or waterways designed for heavy transport, each movement would rely on temporary solutions. These solutions leave few lasting traces, especially if used only once or twice. The absence of visible transport infrastructure does not prove it never existed, but it does mean that the logistics of moving stone into the region remain poorly described. Comparisons with other ancient stone settlements underline how unusual this configuration is. In places where stone foundations are common, they are part of a visible system. Quarries, roads, settlements, and debris align to tell a coherent story. At Baikonur, the foundations appear isolated from such a system. They exist without context above ground, separated from a broader architectural landscape. This isolation pushes the question beyond individual choice and towards structural explanation. The stones themselves do not answer why they are there. They only establish what was required to place them: access to stone, means of transport, knowledge of load-bearing design, and a reason to invest in permanence. None of these requirements are incompatible with human capability. They are, however, incompatible with the assumption that no such investment ever occurred in this landscape. The foundations shift the discussion from whether stone could be used on the steppe to why it would be used at all, and under what circumstances a culture oriented toward movement would decide, even briefly, to build something meant to stay. The condition in which the Baikonur foundations were found matters as much as their existence. They were not described as ruins scattered across the surface, nor as collapsed walls reduced to rubble. They were encountered beneath the ground, intact enough to be recognized as foundations, their geometry still legible, their alignment preserved. This distinction is subtle but important. Collapse leaves patterns of breakage, displaced stone, and uneven accumulation. Destruction scatters material outward. What was recorded in 1818 suggests something different: structures that remained in place while the land around them slowly changed. The foundations showed no clear signs of violent failure. There were no fractured blocks indicative of sudden overload, no disordered piles that would point to structural collapse. Instead, the stones remained set, their relationships to one another maintained. This implies that whatever once rested upon them did not come down in a way that disrupted the base. The absence of impact damage suggests that the upper structures, if they existed, were either removed deliberately or made of materials that did not exert destructive force when they disappeared. Equally telling is the nature of the covering soil. The layers above the foundations were described as relatively uniform, lacking the chaotic mixture that might result from rapid deposition or abrupt disturbance. Sediment appeared to have accumulated gradually, consistent with long-term natural processes such as wind-blown dust, seasonal runoff, and the slow growth and decay of vegetation. Grass took hold. Roots penetrated the upper layers. The surface stabilized. Over time, the presence of stone beneath became invisible to anyone walking above it. This pattern of burial aligns with processes that operate quietly rather than dramatically. Landscapes change incrementally. In open steppe environments, fine particles carried by wind can settle year after year. Small shifts in drainage can redistribute soil across shallow depressions. Human and animal activity can contribute to surface smoothing without drawing attention to what lies below. Over decades and centuries, these processes can obscure features that were once at ground level, especially if those features were not maintained or marked. The key point is that burial does not require destruction. Foundations can remain intact while losing their visibility. When this happens, the absence of ruins above ground does not necessarily indicate absence of prior construction. It indicates only that the surface story has diverged from the subsurface one. At Baikonur, the foundations appear to have been overtaken by time rather than erased by force. No explanation accompanies this transition in the historical record. There is no description of a settlement being dismantled, nor of structures being intentionally buried. There is also no mention of a sudden event that might have overwhelmed the area. The record is silent on process. It notes what was found, not how it came to be hidden. This silence leaves room for interpretation without requiring speculation. The stones were placed. Later, they were covered. The interval between those states is not described. This absence of narrative around burial reinforces the distinction between being buried and being destroyed. One implies continuity of material, the other implies loss. The Baikonur foundations point toward the former. They suggest a past that did not end in obvious rupture, but in quiet withdrawal or gradual abandonment, followed by natural accumulation. Turning from what is present to what is missing sharpens this impression. The records do not include descriptions of the structures that once stood above the foundations. There are no accounts of walls, roofs, or functions. No drawings or measurements survive that would allow reconstruction. The date of construction is not established with precision. The foundations exist without a clear temporal anchor, floating between prehistory and recorded history without being firmly claimed by either. Equally absent are references to a permanent population associated with these structures. No chronicles mention a settled community in this location. No administrative documents list a town or installation requiring stone bases. The social context that would normally accompany such construction is not recorded. The foundations appear without the usual textual companions of buildings, names, purposes, or occupants. What remains, however, is not ambiguity in form. The foundations are geometrically coherent. Their layout follows rational patterns, consistent with load-bearing design. Stones are placed where stones are needed, not randomly. Corners align. Surfaces level. These are not accidental configurations produced by natural processes. They reflect decisions made with an understanding of structure. This combination of presence and absence defines the character of the evidence. The material record affirms intentional construction. The documentary record does not extend that affirmation into narrative detail. There is no indication that information was removed or suppressed. The more modest explanation is that it was never recorded in a way that survived, or that it fell outside the priorities of those who documented the region. In this sense, the Baikonur foundations occupy a space between categories. They are neither ruins of a known city, nor anomalies that can be dismissed as natural. They are material facts without a complete textual frame. The land above them tells a story of openness and movement. The stone below tells a story of placement and endurance. Between the two lies a gap defined not by drama, but by omission. The foundations remain where they were set, unchanged by the absence of explanation. Their geometry persists, their alignment holds. They do not assert a forgotten civilization, nor do they dissolve into the landscape entirely. They simply exist, marking a point at which what is known about the steppe is sufficient to explain most of its history, but not all of it. Several academic interpretations have been proposed to account for the stone foundations recorded beneath the Baikonur steppe, each grounded in established historical reasoning and constrained by the same lack of comprehensive evidence. None of these interpretations is implausible, and none provides a complete resolution. Together, they form a landscape of explanation that remains open, defined by partial fits rather than definitive closure. One interpretation considers the possibility of short-lived agricultural settlement. While the steppe is most strongly associated with pastoral nomadism, historical research acknowledges that patterns of land use were not always static. Periods of climatic stability or localized resource availability could support temporary cultivation or semi-sedentary occupation. In this framework, the stone foundations represent an experiment rather than a tradition, a moment when groups chose to anchor themselves briefly to the land. The strength of this hypothesis lies in its flexibility. It does not require a permanent city or a long-standing stone-building culture. It allows for deviation without overturning the broader understanding of steppe life. Its weakness is material. Agricultural settlements that rely on stone foundations typically leave additional traces: tools, storage facilities, irrigation features, or cultural debris. At Baikonur, such associated evidence has not been clearly documented. leaving the foundations isolated from a wider pattern of agricultural activity. Another explanation frames the foundations as part of a military or logistical installation. Empires moving across Central Asia required infrastructure to support campaigns, supply routes, and territorial control. Stone foundations could have supported warehouses, fortifications, or administrative outposts designed for durability rather than comfort. This interpretation aligns with historical precedents elsewhere, where temporary military needs produced permanent structures. Its advantage is functional clarity. Military construction often prioritizes stability and longevity, even in regions otherwise dominated by mobility. However, this hypothesis encounters its own limitations. Military sites tend to be recorded, if not in local chronicles, then in imperial correspondence or cartographic materials. They also tend to leave behind defensive features such as ditches, ramparts, or spatial layouts that indicate strategic intent. The Baikonur foundations, as described, do not clearly exhibit such characteristics, and their isolation from recorded campaigns weakens the explanatory power of this model. A third interpretation situates the foundations within a transitional phase of cultural change. Central Asia has long been a zone of interaction, where sedentary and nomadic lifeways intersected. Trade corridors, seasonal markets, and administrative hubs could emerge briefly as points of exchange before dissolving back into the surrounding landscape. In this view, the foundations belong to a moment of hybridity, when architectural practices associated with settled life were introduced into a region still oriented toward movement. This explanation accounts for both the presence of stone and the absence of lasting urban development. It suggests that the structures were neither anomalies nor precursors to cities, but products of a shifting social context. Its limitation lies in specificity. Transitional phases are difficult to pin down archaeologically without corroborating evidence. Without clearer dating or associated material culture, the foundations remain suggestive rather than conclusive. Each of these hypotheses resolves certain aspects of the evidence while leaving others unaddressed. Agricultural settlement explains investment in stone, but not the lack of agricultural traces. Military use explains durability, but not the absence of strategic documentation. Cultural transition explains ambiguity, but resists precise definition. None of these explanations cancels the others. They coexist as possibilities rather than competitors, reflecting the complexity of interpreting material remains in regions where written records are sparse and landscapes are dynamic. The persistence of multiple, incomplete explanations raises a broader question about how such evidence is integrated into historical understanding. In the case of Baikonur, the foundations are acknowledged but rarely foregrounded. They do not comfortably fit the dominant narratives of Central Asian history, and so they remain peripheral. This marginalization is not the result of dismissal, but of emphasis. Histories of the region are typically organized around peoples rather than places, movement rather than construction, lineage rather than layout. Central Asian history has long been told through the lens of migration and ethnicity, the rise and movement of groups, the formation and dissolution of confederations, and the flow of trade across vast distances form the core of the narrative. This approach reflects both the nature of the sources and the realities of life on the steppe. Written records often focus on who moved where and when, not on what remained behind. Architecture, especially when limited or short-lived, becomes secondary. As a result, fixed infrastructure tends to receive less attention. Stone foundations without an obvious city attached to them challenge the narrative without overturning it. They introduce questions that do not align neatly with a history built around mobility. Addressing them would require shifting focus from movement to material, from identity to engineering. Such a shift complicates the story without offering immediate clarity, and so it is often avoided. There is also a practical dimension to this omission. Archaeological work in open steppe environments faces logistical challenges. Sites can be difficult to locate, define, and protect. Without prominent ruins, subsurface features may remain undocumented for long periods. When they are recorded, they may appear as isolated data points rather than as part of a coherent settlement pattern. In the absence of sustained investigation, they remain footnotes. Over time, this pattern reinforces itself. Narratives emphasize what is well documented and easily categorized. Material anomalies that resist classification are acknowledged but not integrated. The foundations beneath Baikonur become known but not explained, present but not central. The story of the steppe continues to be told as one of openness and movement, even as stone beneath the surface hints at moments of fixation and permanence. This does not suggest that the prevailing narrative is wrong. It suggests that it is selective, shaped by the questions it asks and the evidence it prioritizes. The stone foundations occupy a space just outside that selection. They do not demand a rewritten history. They simply remind us that landscapes remembered as empty or transient may contain layers of activity that do not conform neatly to dominant models. In this sense, the rarity of the question is itself part of the answer. The Baikonur foundations are rarely discussed not because they are insignificant, but because they sit at the intersection of archaeology, engineering, and historical narrative, a space where disciplines overlap but do not always meet. The stones remain quietly embedded in the steppe, while the stories told above them continue along familiar lines, leaving a gap where material reality and historical interpretation have yet to fully align. The steppe around Baikonur remains as it appears to have always been, wide and level, open to the sky and shaped more by wind than by walls. From the surface, there is no sign of a settlement waiting to be rediscovered. No towers rise from the grass. No streets re-emerge after rain. The land offers continuity rather than revelation, repeating the same visual language of openness that has defined it for centuries. This persistence reinforces the story most people know. The steppe is read as a place of passage, not of accumulation. It carries memory in movement rather than in stone. What exists above ground aligns comfortably with that understanding. The absence of visible ruins feels like confirmation, a quiet agreement between landscape and narrative. Nothing interrupts the horizon. Nothing demands reinterpretation. And yet, beneath that flat surface, stone remains. Foundations set into the earth continue to occupy the positions they were given long ago. Their geometry has not dissolved. Their alignment has not drifted. They do not announce themselves, but they do not disappear either. Covered by layers of soil laid down over time, they persist as material facts, unchanged by the absence of attention. The coexistence of these two realities is what gives the place its unresolved quality. On the surface, Baikonur conforms to expectations. Below, it carries evidence that does not fit neatly into the established picture. The land above tells one story. The ground beneath tells another. Neither story cancels the other. They occupy different depths of the same space. There is no need to imagine a lost city standing where grass now grows. There is no requirement to fill the silence with dramatic explanations. The foundations do not insist on grandeur. They simply indicate that at some point, someone chose to build with stone in a landscape that does not encourage it. That choice, whatever its context, left a trace that outlasted the conditions that made it meaningful. What matters is not whether a complete explanation is reached, but that the question remains open. The stones do not offer their purpose readily. They do not come with inscriptions or dates that resolve uncertainty. They exist as reminders that landscapes remembered as empty can hold layered histories, some of which resist easy categorization. The steppe continues to absorb time. Wind moves soil, grass grows and withers. Seasons pass without marking what lies beneath. Above ground, life proceeds according to patterns long understood. Below ground, stone waits, unaffected by narrative preference. Perhaps the most accurate conclusion is the absence of one. Baikonur remains a place where surface and subsurface tell different versions of the past. The steppe stays flat. The sky remains open. And beneath it all, stone foundations remain in place, quietly asking how much we truly know about what once occupied spaces we have learned to think of as empty.